a couple weeks since I gone live, and I did I did a post the other day. It wasn't a live stream, but I had posted something about one of my friends dying, and which is true. Um, my friend 2 weeks ago had was riding around on his motorcycle, and he lost control a bit, and he crashed, and he ended up being flung from the bike, where he smacked headfirst into a tree and was killed on impact. Um, and that was like a troubling time for me. Like when I got the news, I'm like, I was devastated. I didn't post for 2 weeks because it's like you got to have your time to grieve. Um, he was only 24, which is still kind of young. He was 24 years old, and it was kind of young to be to die. But but there is no what they call a time clock when it comes to death. When but besides that, though, we're going to talk about Mary, Queen of Scots. She was born on December 8th, 1542, and she died on February. She was born December 8th, 1542, and then she died on February 8th of 1587. She was known as Mary Stuart or Mary the First of Scotland, and she was the Queen of Scotland from December 14th of 1542 until her first abdication on July 24th of 1567. She was the only surviving legitimate child of James V of Scotland, but Mary was only 6 days old when her father died, and she inherited the throne. During her childhood, Scotland was governed by regents, first by the heir to the throne, James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, and then by her mother, Mary of Guise. In 1548, she was betrothed to Francis, the Dauphin of France, and was sent to be brought up in France, where she would be safe from invading English forces during the Ruin. Mary married a guy named Francis in 1558, becoming the queen consort of France from his accession in 1559 until his death in December 1560. Widowed at the time, Mary was widowed. At the time, Mary was widowed. Um, Mary returned to Scotland in August of 1561. The tense religious and political climate following the Scottish Reformation that Mary encountered on her return to Scotland was further agitated by prominent Scots such as John Knox, who openly questioned whether her subjects had a duty to obey her. The early years of the personal rule were marked by pragmatism, tolerance, and moderation. Now, she would issue a proclamation accepting the religious settlements in Scotland as she had found it upon her return, retained advisors such as James Stuart, Earl of Moray, her illegitimate half brother, and William Maitland of Lethington, and they governed as the Catholic monarch of a Protestant kingdom. Now, in 1565, Mary married her half-cousin, Henry Stuart, to Lord Darnley, and they had a son named James together. Their marriage soured after Darnley orchestrated the murder of Mary's Italian secretary and close friend, David Rizzio. In February of 1567, Darnley's residence was destroyed by an explosion, and he was found murdered in the nearby garden. Now, James Hepburn, the fourth Earl of Bothwell, was generally believed to have orchestrated Darnley's death, but he was acquitted on the charge in April of 1567, and then the following month he would end up marrying Mary. Following an uprising against the couple, Mary was imprisoned in Lochleven Castle. In July of 1567, she was forced to abdicate in favor of her one-year-old son, James VI, after an unsuccessful attempt to regain the throne. She fled southward, seeking the protection of her first cousin, once removed, Elizabeth I of England. Now, now with Mary as a great-granddaughter of Henry the Seventh of England, Mary had once claimed Elizabeth's throne as her own and was considered the legitimate sovereign of England by many English Catholics, including participants in a rebellion known as the Rising of the North. Perceiving Mary as a big threat, Elizabeth had her confined in various castles and manor houses in the interior of England. After 18 and a half years in captivity, Mary was found guilty of plotting to assassinate Elizabeth in 1586 and was beheaded the following year at Fotheringhay Castle. Now, Mary's life and execution established her in popular culture as a romanticized historical character. Now, Mary was born on December 8th of 1542 at Linlithgow Palace. You can see that here. Here's the castle that she was born in. This is where where both Mary and her father, King James V, were born at, and they were both born in this palace. Now, she was born to King James V and his French second wife, Mary of Guise. She was said to have been born prematurely and was the only legitimate child of James to survive him. She was the great-granddaughter of King Henry VII of England through her paternal grandmother, Margaret Tudor. Now, Margaret was Henry VII's older sister, so Mary was Henry VII's great niece. On December 14th, 6 days after her birth, she became Queen of Scotland when her father had died. She became, and perhaps from the effects of a nervous collapse following the Battle of Solway Moss, or from drinking contaminated water while on his campaign. A popular tale that's been told was as first recorded by John Knox, states that James, upon hearing on his deathbed that his wife had given birth to a daughter, ruefully exclaimed, "It came with a lass, and it would gang with a lass." His house of Stuart had gained the throne of Scotland in the 14th century, following gained the throne of Scotland in the 1st century through a lass via the marriage of Marjorie Bruce, daughter of Robert the Bruce, to Walter Stuart, who's the 6th High Steward of Scotland. And it would be lost from his family with a loss. This legendary statement came true much later, but not through Mary, but through her great-granddaughter Anne, Queen of Great Britain. Mary was christened at the nearby church of St. Michael shortly after she was born. Rumors were spread that she was weak and frail, but an English diplomat, Ralph Sadler, saw the infant at Linlithgow Palace in March of 1543. Unwrapped by her nurse, Jean Sinclair, and wrote, "It is as goodly a child as I've seen of her age as like to live." Now, as Mary was an infant when she inherited the throne, Scotland was ruled by regents until she became an adult. From the outset, there were two claims to the regency, one from a Catholic cardinal Beaton, and the other from the Protestant Earl of Arran, and who was next in line to the throne. Now, Beaton's claim was based on a version of the king's will that his opponents dismissed as a forgery. Arran, with the support of his friends and relations, became the regent until 1554, when Mary's mother managed to remove and succeed him. Now, here's two different coins that you could see here. These are two gold coins. One is 22 shillings of a 1553 burse. One is the coat of arms of Scotland, and the reverse is the royal monogram. Now, when it comes to the Treaty of Greenwich, Henry VII of England took the opportunity of the regency to propose marriage between Mary and his own son and heir Edward, hoping for a union of Scotland and England. On July 1st of 1543, when Mary was 6 months old, the Treaty of Greenwich was signed, which promised that at the age of 10, Mary would marry Edward and move to England, where Henry could oversee her upbringing. The treaty provided that the two countries would remain legally separate, and if the couple failed to have children, the temporary union would dissolve, and Cardinal Beaton rose to power again and began to push a pro-Catholic, pro-French agenda, angering Henry, who wanted to break the Scottish alliance with France. Now, Beaton wanted to move Mary away from the coast to the safety of Stirling Castle. Regent Arran resisted the move, but backed down when Beaton's armed supporters gathered at Linlithgow. The Earl of Lennox escorted Mary and her mother to Stirling on July 27th of 1543 with 3,500 armed men. Mary was crowned in the castle chapel on September 9th of 1543 with such solemnity as they do use in this country, which is not very costly, according to the reports of Ralph Sadler and Henry Ray. Shortly before Mary's coronation, Henry arrested Scottish merchants headed for France and impounded their goods. The arrest caused anger in Scotland, and Iran joined Beaton and became a Catholic. Now, the Treaty of Greenwich was rejected by the Parliament of Scotland in December of that year. The rejection of the marriage treaty and the renewal of the alliance between France and Scotland prompted Henry's rough ruin, a military campaign designed to impose the marriage of Mary to his son. English forces mounted a series of raids on Scottish and French territory, and in May, talking about Mary, Queen of Scots, basically. Now, English forces mounted a series of raids on Scottish and French territory, but in May of 1544, the English Earl of Hertford, later known as the Duke of Somersault, raided Edinburgh, and the Scots took Mary to Dunkeld for safety. In May of 1546, Beaton was murdered by Protestant lairds, and on September 10th of And then September 10th of 1547, 9 months after the death of Henry VII, the Scots suffered a heavy defeat at the Battle of Pinkie. Yeah, there's a lot of different history stuff on here. Mary's guardians, fearful for her safety, sent her to Ichmahome Priory for no more than 3 weeks and turned to the French for help. Now, King Henry II of France proposed to unite France and Scotland by marrying the young queen to his 3-year-old son, the Dauphin Francis, on the promise of French military help and a French dukedom for himself. Iran agreed to the marriage eventually, but in February 1548, Mary was moved again for her safety to Dumbarton Castle. The English left a trail of devastation behind them once more and seized the strategic town of Haddington in June. The much-awaited French help arrived at Leith to besiege and ultimately take Haddington. On July 7th of 1548, the Scottish Parliament had a nunnery near the town agreed to the French marriage treaty. Now, with Mary's life in France, with her marriage agreement in place, 5-year-old Mary was sent to France to spend the next 13 years at the French court. The French fleet, sent by Henry II, commanded by Nicholas de Villeganon, sailed with Mary from Dumbarton on August 7th of 1548, and arrived a week later or more later at Roscoff or Saint Paul de Leon in Brittany. Now Mary was accompanied by her own court, including 2 illegitimate half-brothers and the 4 girls her own age, all named Mary, who were the daughters of some of the noblest families in Scotland: Beaton, Sutton, Fleming, and Livingston. Janet, Lady Fleming, who was Mary Fleming's mother and James V's half-sister, was appointed governess. When Lady Fleming left France in 1551, she was succeeded by French governess Francois de Porore. And you can see Mary and her supposed to be her husband here, Francis, and that was about 1574. According to many accounts, people that knew Mary said she was a vivacious, beautiful, and clever person. Mary had a promising childhood. But I heard that Helena Troy was the most beautiful woman that ever walked the earth, but I would have to pull that up. Yeah, they don't they? Now, at the French court, she was a favorite with many people except Henry II's wife, Catherine de Medici. Now, Mary learned to play lute and virginals, who was competent in prose, poetry, and horsemanship, falconry, and needlework, and was taught French, Italian, Latin, Spanish, and Greek, in addition to her native Scottish language. Johann Paul, a Belladin, taught her how to dance. Her future sister-in-law, Elizabeth of Valois, became a close friend of whom Mary retained nostalgic memories in later life. Mary's maternal grandmother, Antoinette de Morden, was another strong influence in her childhood and acted as one of her principal advisors. Now, portraits of Mary show that she had a small, oval-shaped head, a long, graceful neck, bright auburn hair, hazel brown eyes, under heavy lowered eyelids and a fine arched brows, smooth pale skin, and a high forehead, and regular firm features. She was considered a pretty child, and later, as a woman, strikingly attractive. That's what people had said about her. But at some point in her infancy as a childhood, she did catch smallpox, but it did not mark any futures for her. Now, Mary was elegant and especially tall by 16th century standards. She was damn near 6 feet tall, while Henry II, son and heir of France, stuttered and was unusually short. Now, Henry commented, from the very day that they met, my son and she got on as well together as if they had known each other for a long time. On April 4th of 1558, Mary signed a secret agreement bequeathing Scotland and her claim to England to the French crown if she died without any issue. 20 days later, she married the Dauphin at Notre Dame de Paris, and he became King Consort of England. Now Scotland has a coat of arms, or actually, France does too, and this is what the coat of arms looks like. Now, the coat of arms sent from France in July 1559, sinister, Mary's arms as Queen of the Scotland, quartered with the arms of England, reflecting her claim to the English throne. Dexter, France's arms as Dauphin of France and King Consort of Scotland, with an estuary of England, or whatever the fuck you say that. Now, in November of 1558, Henry VIII's elder daughter, Mary the First of England, was succeeded by her only surviving sibling, Elizabeth I. Now, under the Third Succession Act, passed in 1543 by the Parliament of England, Elizabeth was recognized as her sister's heir, and Henry VIII's last will and testament had excluded the Stuarts from succeeding to the English throne. Now, yet, in the eyes of many Catholics, Elizabeth was illegitimate, and Mary Stuart was the rightful Queen of England, as the senior surviving legitimate descendant of Henry VII through her grandmother, Margaret Tudor. Now, Henry II of France proclaimed his eldest son and daughter-in-law King and Queen of England. In France, the royal arms of England were quartered with those of France and Mary's claim to the English throne was a perennial sticking point between her and Elizabeth. When Henry II died on July 10th of 1559 from injuries sustained in a jousting tournament, yes, we know you're gay, audio. No, I'm not gay at all. Yeah, there's a guy on here named Audio. He's gay. That's what he's saying. That's what he's saying here, that he's gay. I don't care that you're gay, Audio. It's not. Yes, Audio, we know you're gay. And we know you have no job, so basically go find one. So... I know, but Audio's gay, but that's what he seems to keep telling me. I'm like, I don't care that he's gay. I don't care that he sucks dick and puts from the rough. So two of the Queen's uncles, the Duke of Guise and the Cardinal of Lorraine, were now dominant in French politics. Now enjoying an ascendancy called by some historians called La Tyrannie Gassenni. In Scotland, the power of the Protestant lords of the congregation was rising at the expense of Mary's mother, Mary of Guise, who attained effective control only through the use of French troops. Now, in early 1560, the Protestant lords invited English troops into Scotland in an attempt to secure Protestantism. A Huguenot uprising in France, the tumult of Amboise, made it impossible for the French to send any further support. Now, instead, the Guise brothers sent ambassadors to negotiate a settlement. On July 11th of 1560, their sister Mary's mother died, and so the question of future Franco-Scots relations was a pressing one. Under the terms of the Treaty of Edinburgh, signed by Mary's representatives on July 6th of 1560, France and England undertook. I don't care that you're gay, audio. Okay, go. If you want to go, if you love sucking dick, go do that. Um, Now, France and England undertook to withdraw troops from Scotland. France recognized Elizabeth's right to rule England, but the 17-year-old Mary, still in France and grieving for her mother, refused to ratify that treaty. She did return to Scotland, and Francis II died on December 5th of 1560 of a middle ear infection that led to an abscess in his brain. Mary was grief-stricken, and her mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici, became regent for the late king's 10-year-old brother, Charles IX, who inherited the French throne. Mary returned to Scotland 9 months later, arriving in Leith on August 19th of 1561. Having lived in France since the age of 5, Mary had little direct experience of the dangerous and complex political situation when she moved back to Scotland. Now, Mary was a devout Catholic, and she was regarded with suspicion by many of her subjects, as well as by the Queen of England. Now, Scotland was torn between Catholic and Protestant factions. Mary's illegitimate half-brother, the Earl of Moray, was a leader of the Protestants. The Protestant reformer John Knox preached against Mary, condemning her for hearing Mass, dancing, and dressing too elaborately. She summoned him to her presence to remonstrate with him, but was unsuccessful. She later charged him with treason, but he was acquitted and released. Now, to the surprise and dismay of the Catholic party, Mary tolerated the newly established Protestant ascendancy and kept her half-brother Moray as her chief advisor. Her privy council consisted of 16 men appointed on September 6th of 1561 and retained those who already held the offices of state. The council was dominated by the Protestant leaders from the Reformation crisis of 1551 to 1560 and the Earls of Argyll, Glencairn, and Moray. Only 4 of the councillors were Catholic: the Earls of Athol, Errol, Montrose, and Huntley, who was Lord Chancellor. Now, modern historian Jenny Wormold, who found this remarkable and suggested that Mary's failure to appoint a council sympathetic to Catholic and French interests was an indication of her focus on the English throne over the internal problems of Scotland. Even the one significant later addition to the council, Lord Ruthven, in December of 1563, was another Protestant whom Mary personally disliked. In this, she was acknowledging her lack of effective military power in the face of the Protestant lords, while also following a policy that strengthened her links with England. And she joined with Moray in the destruction of Scotland's leading Catholic magnate, Lord Huntley, in 1562, after he led a rebellion against her in the Highlands. Now Mary would send William Maitland of Lethington as an ambassador to the English court to put the case for Mary as the heir presumptive to the English throne. Now Elizabeth refused to name a potential heir, fearing that one would invite conspiracy to displace her with the nominated successor. Now, however, she reassured Maitland that she knew no one better with a better claim than Mary. In late 1561 and early 1562, arrangements were made for the two queens to meet in England at York or Nottingham in August on September of 1562. Now, in July, Elizabeth sent Henry Sidney to cancel Mary's visit because of the civil war that was going on in France. Now, Mary then returned her attention to finding a new husband from the royalty of Europe with her uncle, when her uncle, the Cardinal of Lorraine, began the negotiations with the Archduke Charles of Austria without her consent. She angrily objected, and the negotiations foundered. Now, her own attempt to negotiate a marriage to Don Carlos, the mentally unstable heir apparent of King Philip II of Spain, was rebuffed by Philip. Now, Elizabeth attempted to neutralize Mary by suggesting that she marry English Protestant Robert Dudley, who was the first Earl of Leicester. Now, Dudley was Henry's was Henry Sidley's brother-in-law and the English Queen's own favorite, whom Elizabeth trusted and thought she could control. She sent an ambassador, Thomas Randolph, to tell Mary that if she married an English nobleman, Elizabeth would proceed to the inquisition of her right and title to be her next cousin and heir. The proposal came to nothing, but not least because the intended bridegroom was unwilling. Now, in contrast, a French poet at Mary's court, Pierre, was apparently besotted with Mary. In early 1563, he was discovered during a security search hidden underneath her bed, apparently planning to surprise her when she was alone and declare her love for her. Now, Mary was horrified and banished him from Scotland. He ignored the edict, but 2 days later, he forced his way into her chamber as she was about to disrobe, and she reacted with fury and fear. When Mary rushed into the room after hearing her cries for help, she shouted, "Thrust your dagger into the villain." Now, Moray refused as Chastelard was already under a restraint, and Chastelard was tried for treason and beheaded. Maitland claimed that Chastelard's ardor was feigned and that he was part of a Huguenot plan to discredit Mary by tarnishing her reputation. Now, here is Mary with her second husband, Lord Darnley. Now Mary had briefly met her English-born half-cousin Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in February of 1561, when she was in mourning for Frances Darnley's parents. The Earl and the Countess of Lennox were Scottish aristocrats as well as English landowners. Now they sent him to France to extend their condolences while hoping for a potential match between their son and Mary. But both Mary and Darnley were grandchildren of Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII of England, and patrilineal descendants of the High Stewards of Scotland. Now, Darnley shared a more recent Stuart lineage with the Hamilton family as a descendant of Mary Stuart, Countess of Arran, a daughter of James II of Scotland. They next met on Saturday, February 17th, 1565, at Wemyss Castle in Scotland. Now, Mary fell in love with the long lad, as Queen Elizabeth called him, since he was over 6 feet tall, and they married at Holyrood Place on July 29th of 1565, even though both were Catholic and a papal dispensation for their marriage, or first cousins, had not been obtained. Now, English statesmen William Cecil and the Earl of Leicester had worked to obtain Darnley's license to travel to Scotland from his home in England. Many people care. Now, Tree, we know we don't care what you got to say. Now, English statesman William Cecil and the Earl of Leicester, like I said, had worked to obtain Darnley's license to travel to Scotland from his home in England. Now, even though her advisors had brought the couple together, Elizabeth felt threatened by the marriage because, as descendants of her aunt, both Mary and Darnley were claimants to the English throne, and she did not like that. Now, their children, if any, would inherit an even stronger and combined claim. Now, Mary's insistence on the marriage seems to have stemmed from passion rather than calculation. Now, the English ambassador Nicholas Throckmorton stated the saying that surely the Queen Mary is bewitched, adding that the marriage would only be averted by violence. But the union infuriated Elizabeth, who felt the marriage should not have gone ahead without her permission, as Darnley was both her cousin and an English subject. Now, Mary's marriage to a leading Catholic precipitated Mary's half-brother, the Earl of Moray, to join with other Protestant lords, including Lords Argyll and Glencairn, in an open rebellion. Now, Mary set out from Edinburgh on August 26 of 1565 to confront them. Basically, she carried a pistol known as a dag on her saddle. On the 30th of that month, Moray entered Edinburgh, but left soon afterwards, having failed to take the castle. Now, Mary returned to Edinburgh the following the following month to raise more troops in what became known as the chase about raid. Mary with her forces and Murray with the rebellious lords roamed around Scotland without ever engaging in direct combat. Now Mary's numbers were boosted by the release and restoration to favor the favor of Lord Huntley's son, and the return of James Hepburn, first basically the fourth Earl of Bothwell, from exile in France. Now unable to muster sufficient support, Murray would leave Scotland in October for asylum in England. Now Mary brought in her Privy Council, bringing in both Catholics, Bishop of Ross, John Leslie, and the Provost of Edinburgh, Simon Preston of Craig Miller, and Protestants, the new Lord Huntley, Bishop of Galloway, Alexander Gordon, John Maxwell of Terraglas, and James Balfour. It is actually cold outside like a motherfucker. I was freezing at work today, so at my other job earlier, basically, it was freezing. It's going to be in the negatives later on today, but if not now, and it's going to be cold as hell on Saturday and Sunday too. And it's a good thing I don't need to go outside because it's fucking cold. I'm not going anywhere this weekend anyway. I'm just staying home. And before long, Darnley grew arrogant, and not content with his position as a king consort, he demanded that the crown matrimonial, which would have made him a co-sovereign of Scotland with the right to keep the Scottish throne for himself if he outlived his wife. Mary refused this request, claiming that he needed to wait until he was of age, and their marriage grew, or until their marriage grew strained. Now, although they conceived by October of 1565, he was jealous of her friendship with her Catholic private secretary, David Rizzio, who was rumored to be the father of her child. Now, by March of 1566, Darnley had entered into a secret conspiracy with Protestant lords, including the nobles who had rebelled against Mary in the Chase-about raid. On March 9th, a group of the conspirators, accompanied by Darnley, stabbed Rizzio to death in front of the 6 months pregnant Mary at a dinner party in Holyrood Place. Over the next 2 days, a disillusioned Darnley switched sides, and Mary had received Murray at Holyrood. On the night of March 11th or 12th, Darnley and Mary escaped from the palace, and they took temporary refuge in Dunbar Castle before returning to Edinburgh on March 18th. The former rebels, Lord Moray, Argyll, and Glencairn were restored to the council. Now, Mary's son by Darnley, James, was born on June 19th of 1566 in Edinburgh Castle. However, the murder of Rizzio led to the breakdown of her marriage in October of 1566. There is no God, so basically, now in October of 1566, while staying at Jedburgh in the Scottish borders, Mary made a journey on horseback. Now, in October 1566, while staying at Jedburgh and the Scottish borders, Mary made a journey on horseback of at least 4 hours each way to visit the Earl of Bothwell at Hermitage Castle, where he lay ill from wounds sustained in a skirmish with John Eliot at Park. The ride was later used as evidence by Mary's enemies that the two were lovers, though no suspicions were voiced at the time, and Mary had been accompanied by her counselors and guards. Now, immediately after her return to Jedburgh, she suffered a serious illness that included frequent vomiting, loss of sight, loss of speech, convulsions, and periods of unconsciousness. And people thought her to be dying at that time, but she didn't. Her recovery from October 25th onwards was credited to the skill of her French physicians, and the cause of her illness to her dying day was not known. But potential diagnoses include physical exhaustion and mental stress, hemorrhage of a gastric ulcer, and peripheria. Back then, they didn't have the type of stuff that we have now to be able to to pick up diagnoses. At Craigmillar Castle near Edinburgh at the end of November 1566, Mary and leading nobles had held a meeting to discuss the problem of Darnley. Now, the divorce was discussed, but a bond was probably sworn between the lords present to remove Darnley by other means. It was thought to be expedient and most profitable for the Commonwealth that such a young fool and proud tyrant should not reign or bear rule over them, and that he should be put off by one way or another, and whosoever should take the deed in hand to do it, and that they should defend. Now Darnley would fear for his safety, and after the baptism of his son at Stirling and shortly before Christmas, he went to Glasgow to stay on his father's estates. At the start of the journey, he was afflicted by a fever, possibly smallpox, or syphilis as a result of poison, and he remained ill for some weeks. In late January of 1567, Mary prompted her husband to return to Edinburgh. He recuperated from his illness in a house belonging to the brother of James Balfour at the former abbey of Kirklefield, just within the city wall. Mary visited him daily, so that it appeared a reconciliation was in progress. On the night of February 9th and 10th of 1567, Mary visited her husband in the early evening and then attended the wedding celebrations of a member of her household, Bastion Pages. In the early hours of the morning, an explosion devastated Kirklefield. Darnley was found dead in the garden, apparently smothered, and there were no visible marks of strangulation or violence on the body, but Bothwell Murray, Secretary Maitland, and the Earl of Morton, and Mary herself were among those who came under suspicion. Elizabeth wrote to Mary of the rumors, "I should ill fulfill the office of a faithful cousin or an affectionate friend if I did not tell you what the world is thinking. Men say that instead of ceasing the murders, you were looking through your fingers while they escape, and that you would not seek revenge on those who have done so much pleasure, as though the deed would never have taken place had not the doers or if it had been assured of impunity. For myself, I beg you to believe that I will not harbor such a thought." Now, by the end of February, Bothwell was generally believed to be guilty of Darnley's assassination. Lennox, Darnley's father, demanded that Bothwell be tried before the States of Parliament, to which Mary agreed, but Lennox's request for a delay to gather evidence was denied. In the absence of Lennox, and with no evidence presented, Bothwell was acquitted after a 7-hour trial on April 12th. A week later, Bothwell managed to convince more than 24 lords and bishops to sign the Ainsley Tavern Bond, in which they agreed to support his aim to marry the Queen. Now here's a picture of Mary depicted with her son James. That was back in between April 21st and April 23rd of 1567, Mary visited her son at Stirling for the last time. On her way back to Edinburgh on April 24th, Mary was abducted, willingly or not, by Lord Bothwell and his men, and taken to Dunbar Castle, where it was rumored that he may have raped her. On May 6th, Mary and Bothwell returned to Edinburgh on May 15th at either Holyrood Palace or Holyrood Abbey, where they married according to Protestant rites. Bothwell and his first wife, Jane Gordon, who was the sister of Lord Huntley, had divorced 12 days previously. Now, originally, Mary had believed that many nobles had supported her marriage, but relations quickly soured. Had soured between the newly elevated Bothwell, created Duke of Orkney, and his former peers, and the marriage proved to be deeply unpopular. Catholics considered the marriage unlawful, since they did not recognize Bothwell's divorce or the validity of the Protestant service. Now, both Protestants and Catholics were shocked that Mary should marry the man accused of murdering her husband, and the marriage was tempestuous, and Mary became despondent. Now, 26 Scottish peers, known as the Confederate Lords, turned against Mary and Bothwell and raised their own army. Mary and Bothwell confronted the Lords at Carberry Hill on the grounds of Carberry Tower on June 15th. But there was no battle, as Mary's forces dwindled away through desertion during negotiations, and Bothwell was given safe passage from the field, and the Lords took Mary to Edinburgh, where crowds of spectators denounced her as an adulteress and a murderer. The following night, she was imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle on an island in the middle of Loch Leven. Between July 20th and July 23rd, Mary had twins, but miscarried them. On July 24th, she was forced to abdicate in favor of her 1-year-old son James, and Murray was made regent. Now, while Bothwell was driven into exile, he was imprisoned in Denmark, but became insane, and he would die in 1578. On May 2nd of 1568, Mary escaped from Loch Leven Castle with the aid of George Douglas, who was the brother of William Douglas. The castle's owner, managing to raise an army of 6,000 men, she met Murray's smaller forces at the Battle of Langside on May 13th. Defeated, she fled south, planning to seek asylum from Elizabeth after spending the night at Dundrennan Abbey. She crossed the Solway Firth into England by fishing boat on May 16th. And she landed at Workington in Cumberland in the north of England and stayed overnight at Workington Hall. On May 18th, local officials led by Richard Balfour took her into protective custody at Carlisle Castle. Now, Mary apparently expected her cousin Elizabeth to help her regain her throne, but Elizabeth was cautious, ordering an inquiry into the conduct of the Confederate Lords and the question of whether Mary was guilty of Darnley's murder. In mid-July of 1568, English authorities moved Mary to Bolton Castle because it was farther from the Scottish border, but not too close to London, and Mary's clothes sent from Loch Leven Castle arrived on July 20th. A commission of inquiry, or conference as it was known, was held in York and later Westminster, between October 1568 and January of 1569. In Scotland, her supporters fought a civil war against Regent Moray and his successors. As an anointed queen, Mary refused to acknowledge the power of any court to try her, and she refused to attend the inquiry at York firstly, but sent representatives. Elizabeth forbade her attendance anyway, as evidence against Mary. Murray presented the so-called casket letters, 8 unsigned letters, purportedly from Mary to Bothwell, 2 marriage contracts, and a love sonnet or sonnets. All were said to have been found in a silver gilt casket just less than 1 foot away, and are 1 foot long and decorated with the monogram of King Francis II. And Mary denied writing them and insisted that they were forgeries, arguing that her handwriting was not difficult to imitate. And they are widely believed to be crucial as to whether Mary shared the guilt for Darnley's murder. And the head of the Commission of Inquiry, the Duke of Norfolk, described them as horrible letters and diverse fond ballads. He sent copies to Elizabeth, saying that if they were genuine, it might prove Mary's guilt. Now, the authenticity of the casket letters has been the source of much controversy among historians. It is impossible now to prove either way, but the originals written in French were possibly destroyed in 1584 by Mary's son James. The surviving copies in French or translated into English do not form a complete set. There are incomplete printed transcriptions in English, Scottish, and French and Latin from the 1570s, but other documents scrutinized included Bothwell's divorce from Jean Gordon, and Moray had sent a messenger in September to Dunbar to get a copy of the proceedings from the town registers, and basically I don't think he did. Now, Mary's biographers, such as Antonia Fraser, Ellison Weir, and John Guy, have concluded that either the documents were complete forgeries or incriminating passages were inserted into genuine letters, or the letters were written to Bothwell by a different person or written by Mary to a different person. Guy points out that the letters are disjointed and that the French language and grammar employed in the sonnets are too poor for a writer with Mary's education, but certain phrases in the letters, including verses in the style of Ronsard and some characteristics of style, are compatible with known writings by Mary. And here's a portrait of Mary again. This is a portrait of Mary from the later half of the 16th century. Now, the casket letters did not appear publicly until to the conference of 1568, although the Scottish Privy Council had seen them by December of 1567. Mary had been forced to abdicate and held captive for the better part of a year in Scotland, and the letters were never made public to support her imprisonment and forced abdication. Historian Jenny Wormald believes that this reluctance on the part of the Scots to produce the letters and their destruction in 1584. Whatever their content constitute proof that they contained real evidence against Mary. But in contrast, Weir thinks it demonstrates that the Lords required them to fabricate them. At least some of Mary's contemporaries who saw the letters had no doubt that they were genuine. Among them was the Duke of Norfolk, who secretly conspired to marry Mary in the course of the commission, although he denied it when Elizabeth alluded to his marriage plan, saying he meant never to marry with a person where he could not be sure of his pillow. Now, the majority of the commissioners accepted the casket letters as genuine after a study of their contents and a comparison of the penmanship with examples of Mary's handwriting. Elizabeth, as she had wished, concluded the inquiry with a verdict that nothing was proven against either the Confederate Lords or Mary in itself. For overriding political reasons, Elizabeth wished neither to convict nor to acquit Mary of murder, but there was never any intention to proceed judiciously. Now, the conference was intended as a political exercise. In the end, Moray returned to Scotland as a regent, and Mary remained in custody in England. Elizabeth succeeded in maintaining a Protestant government in Scotland without either condemning or releasing her fellow sovereign. In Fraser's opinion, it was one of the strangest trials in England in legal history, ending with no finding of guilt against either party, one of whom was allowed to return home to Scotland while the other remained in custody. Now, on January 26 of 1569, Mary was moved to Tutbury Castle and placed in the custody of George Talbot, the 6th Earl of Shrewsbury, and his formidable wife Bess of Hardwicke. Elizabeth considered Mary's designs in the English throne to be a serious threat, and so confined her to Shrewsbury's properties, including Tutbury, Sheffield Castle, Sheffield Manor Lodge, Wingfield Manor, and Chatsworth House, and located in the interior of England, halfway between Scotland and London, and distant from the sea. Mary was permitted her own domestic staff, which numbered fewer than 16. She needed 30 carts to transport her belongings from house to house, but her chambers were decorated with fine tapestries and carpets, as well as her cloth of state, on which she had the French phrase, "Edma fin esmon commencement." So basically, her chambers were decorated with fine tapestries and carpets, as well as her cloth of state, on which she had the French phrase, "Edma fin est mon commencement," which means "in my end lies my beginning." Embroidered. Basically, her bed linen was changed daily, and her own chefs prepared meals with a choice of 32 dishes served up on silver plates. She was occasionally allowed outside under strict supervision, but spent 7 summers at the small town of Buxton and spent much of her time doing embroidery. Her health declined, perhaps through porphyria or a lack of exercise. By the 1580s, she had severe rheumatism in her limbs, rendering her to be lame. And can you guys hear me or not? I don't know if you guys can. Yeah, that's because it was muted because somebody called my phone. That's probably why it muted for a little bit until the phone rang out. Now, in May of 1569, Elizabeth attempted to mediate the restoration of Mary in return for guarantees of the Protestant religion, but a convention held at Perth rejected the deal overwhelmingly, and Norfolk continued to scheme for a marriage with Mary, and Elizabeth imprisoned him in the Tower of London between October 1569 and August of 1570. Now, early the following year, Moray was assassinated, and his death occurred soon after an unsuccessful rebellion in the north of England, led by Catholic earls, which persuaded Elizabeth that Mary was a threat, and English troops then intervened in the Scottish Civil War, consolidating the power of the anti-Marian forces. Elizabeth's principal secretary, William Cecil, Lord Burghley, and Francis Walsingham watched Mary carefully with the aid of spies placed in her household. In 1571, Cecil and Walsingham, at that time England's ambassador to France, uncovered the Rodolphi plot and planned to replace Elizabeth with Mary with the help of Spanish troops and the Duke of Norfolk. And Norfolk was executed, and the English Parliament introduced a bill burying Mary from the throne, to which Elizabeth refused to give royal assent. To discredit Mary, the casket letters were published in London, and plots centered on Mary continued. Pope Gregory the 13th endorsed one plan in the latter half of the 1570s, to marry her to the governor of the Low Countries, and an illegitimate half brother of Philip II of Spain, John of Austria, who was supposed to organize the invasion of England from the Spanish Netherlands. Now, Mary would sent letters to cipher to the French ambassador to England, Michael de Castelnau, scores of which were discovered and decrypted between the years of 2022 and 2023. After the Throckmorton plot of 1583, Walsingham, now the Queen's principal secretary, introduced the Bond of Association and the Act for the Queen's Safety, which sanctioned the killing of anyone who plotted against Elizabeth and aimed to prevent a putative state successor from profiting from her murder. Now, in 1584, Mary proposed association with her son James. She announced that she was ready to stay in England, to renounce the Pope's bull of excommunication, and to retire, abandoning her intentions to the English throne. She was also offered to join in the offensive league against France for Scotland. She proposed a general amnesty, agreed that James should marry him. Should marry with Elizabeth's knowledge, and accepted that there should be no change in religion. Her only condition was the immediate alleviation of the conditions of her captivity, and James went along with the idea for a while, but eventually rejected it and signed an alliance treaty with Elizabeth, abandoning his own mother. Elizabeth also rejected the association because she did not trust Mary to cease plotting against her during the negotiations. Now, in February of 1585, William Parry was convicted of plotting to assassinate Elizabeth without Mary's knowledge, although her regent, Thomas Morton, was implicated. In April, Mary was placed in the stricter custody of Amias Paulet. At Christmas, she was moved to a moated manor house at Chartley. On August 11th of 1586, after being implicated in the Babington plots, Mary was arrested while out riding and taken to Tixall Hall in Staffordshire. In a successful attempt to entrap her, Walsingham had deliberately arranged for Mary's letters to be smuggled out of Chartley, and Mary was misled into thinking her letters were secure, while in reality they were deciphered and read by Walsingham, and from these letters it was clear that Mary had sanctioned the attempted assassination of Elizabeth. Mary was eventually moved to Fotheringhay Hay Castle in a 4-day journey ending on September 25th. In October, she was put on trial for treason under the Act for the Queen's Safety before a court of 36 noblemen, including Cecil, Shrewsbury, and Walsingham. Spirited in her defense, Mary denied the charges. She told her triers, "Look to your consciences and remember that the theater of the whole world is wider than the kingdom of England." She protested that she had been denied the opportunity to review the evidence, and that her papers had been removed from her, but that she was denied access to legal counsel, and that as a foreign anointed queen, she had never been an English subject and therefore cannot be convicted of treason. But she was eventually convicted on October 25th and sentenced to death with only one commissioner, Lord Zouche, expressing any form of dissent. Nevertheless, Elizabeth hesitated to order her execution, even in the face of pressure from the English Parliament to carry out the sentence. Now, she was concerned that the killing of a queen set a discreditable precedent, and was fearful of the consequences, especially if, in retaliation, Mary's son James formed an alliance with the Catholic powers and invaded England. Now, Elizabeth asked Paulette, Mary's final custodian, if he would contrive a clandestine way to shorten the life of Mary, which he refused to do on the grounds of that he would not make a shipwreck of my conscience, or leave so great a blot on my poor posterity. On February 1st of 1587, Elizabeth signed the death warrant and entrusted it to William Davison, a Privy Council. On February 3rd, 10 members of the Privy Council of England, having been summoned by Cecil without Elizabeth's knowledge, decided to carry out the sentence at once. At Fotheringhay on the evening of February 7th of 1587, Mary was told she would be executed the next morning. She spent the last hours of her life in prayer, distributing her belongings to her household and writing her will and letter to the King of France. The scaffold that was erected in the Great Hall was draped in black cloth. It was reached by 2 or 3 steep steps and furnished with a block, a cushion for her to kneel on, and 3 stools for her and the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, who were there to witness the execution. The executioner Bull and his assistant knelt before her and asked forgiveness, as it was typical for the executioner to request a pardon of the one being put to death. Mary replied, "I forgive you with all my heart for now. I hope you should make an end to all my troubles." Her servants, Jane Kennedy and Elizabeth Curley, and the executioners helped Mary remove her outer garments, revealing a velvet petticoat and a pair of sleeves in crimson brown, the little girl color of martyrdom in the Catholic Church, with a black satin bodice and black trimming. She was blindfolded by Kennedy with a white veil embroidered in gold, knelt down on the cushion in front of the block on which she positioned her head and stretched out her arms. Her last words were "En manus taus," which means into tiny hands. "O Lord, I condemn my spirit." Mary was not beheaded with one single axe strike. The first blow missed her neck and struck the back of her head. The second blow severed the neck, except for a small bit of sinew, which the executioner cut through using the axe. Now afterwards, he held her head aloft and declared, "God save the Queen." At that moment, the auburn tresses in his hand turned out to be a wig, and the head fell to the ground, revealing that Mary had very short gray hair. Cecil's nephew, who was present at the execution, reported to his uncle that after her death, her lips stirred up and down a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off, and that a small dog owned by the Queen emerged from hiding among her skirts. Though Emmanuel Thomas Scone does not include those details in his contemporary account. I go to school too myself. I go to college. I don't know about you. Now, when the news of the execution reached Elizabeth, she became indignant and asserted that Davison had disobeyed her instructions not to part with the warrants and that the Privy Council had acted without her authority. Now, Elizabeth's facilitation and deliberately vague instructions gave her plausible deniability to attempt to avoid the direct stain of Mary's blood, but Davison was arrested, thrown into the Tower of London, and found guilty of misprision. He was released 19 months later after Cecil and Walsingham interceded on his behalf. Mary's request to be buried in France was refused by Elizabeth. Her body was embalmed and left in a secure lead coffin in her burial in a Protestant service at Peterborough Cathedral in late July of 1587. Her entrails, removed as part of the embalming process, were buried secretly within Fotheringhay Castle. Her body was exhumed in 1612 when her son James VI and the First ordered that she be reinterred in Westminster Abbey in a chapel opposite the tomb of Elizabeth. In 1867, her tomb was opened in an attempt to ascertain the resting place of her son, James I of England. He was ultimately found with With Henry VII, many of her other descendants, including Elizabeth of Bohemia, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and the children of Anne, Queen of Great Britain, were interred all in that vault. Now, assessments of Mary in the 16th century divided between Protestant reformers such as George Buchanan and John Knox, who vilified her mercilessly, and Catholic apologists such as Adam Blackwood, also who praised, defended, and eulogized her. After the accession of James I in England, historian William Camden wrote an officially sanctioned biography that drew from original documents. It condemned Buchanan's work as an invention and emphasized Mary's evil fortunes rather than her evil character. Differing interpretations persisted into the 18th century. William Robertson and David Hume argued that the casket letters were genuine and that Mary was guilty of adultery and murder, while William Tytler had argued the reverse. In the later half of the 20th century, the work of Antonia Fraser was acclaimed as more objective and free from the excess of adulation or attack that had characterized older biographers. And her contemporaries Gordon Donaldson and Ian B. Cohen also produced more balanced works. Now, when it comes to historian Jenny Wormold, concluded that Mary was a tragic failure who was unable to cope with the demands placed on her, but hers was a rare dissenting view in a post-Fraser tradition that Mary was a pawn in the hands of scheming noblemen, and there was no concrete proof of her complicity in Darnley's murder or of a conspiracy with Bothwell. Such accusations rest on assumptions, and Buchanan's biography is today discredited as almost complete fantasy. Mary's courage at her execution helped establish her popular image as a heroic victim in a dramatic tragedy. That is the end of our video of Mary, Queen of Scot. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thanks for tuning in and listening. If you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King, for more videos like this. For any history videos. Like I said, not every video is going to be history. I got some videos on history, some on movies, some on music that I'm going to be putting out. But if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King, for more videos like this. And I'll be back next week with another video, which will be, let's go here, something called the Beaver Wars. We're going to put that out. But thanks for all that tuned in. I hope you guys had a great time. See you next week.